Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah ma ba'd. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He makes our gathering a gathering of blessing, inshallah ta'ala, and that He teaches us beneficial knowledge and allows us to be among those who apply their knowledge in their life. Allahumma ameen. To proceed, inshallah ta'ala, tonight we're continuing with our series, the top 50 hadith that every Muslim should know. And tonight we're on hadith number 15. And hadith number 15 is a hadith that most, if not all Muslims know, inshallah ta'ala. So today should primarily be as a reminder and as a refresher, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. This hadith is narrated by a large number of companions. I think when we went over the different versions, there were at least 6 or 7 different companions who have narrated this hadith, all of them with authentic chains. And the hadith begins. This version is found in Sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim, and it is narrated by Abu Hurayrah radiallahu anhu, where he says that the Prophet ﷺ has said the following: "Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawm al-akhir," and this is how it begins. Right? So the beginning part is a very well-known part, and there's actually different versions of what actually is to follow. So it says, whoever believes in Allah on the last day, then, and then there's blank, right? There's 3 different versions, or 3 different things that are said, and in fact there's actually multiple versions. So whoever believes in Allah on the last day, and then the first one he says, فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ, then let him be, or he should be, what? Generous to his neighbor. In another narration it says, فَلَا يُؤْذِي جَارَهُ, then he should not hurt, or he should not be harmful towards his neighbor. Very good. So we have that, number 1. Then number 2, وَمَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيُكْرِمْ ضَيْفَهُ, and whoever believes in Allah on the last day, let him be generous to his guest. So this is number 2. And then the last one is, وَمَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ, whoever believes in Allah on the last day, then let him say something good or be silent. Right? And like we said, this hadith is authentic. It's narrated in almost every book of hadith. And like we said, there's a number of companions. It's been narrated by Aisha, Ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Amr, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, Ibn Abbas, Aisha. As we said, Abu Hurayrah, the narration that we have. All of them narrate this hadith. So first off, we'll go over what the phrase actually means. Who believes in Allah on the last day? It's telling us very explicitly that our deeds have a relationship with our iman. In fact, they are a part of iman. Actions are a part of faith. Right? As Sunni Muslims, we don't believe in the separation of actions and faith, meaning being just internally in the heart. There was a group, Al-Jahmiyyah and some others, who did believe that what your faith is completely has nothing to do with your actions. Right? So your faith is one thing, your actions are a separate thing. This is what we're saying as Sunni Muslims we believe is wrong. Okay? I hope inshallah ta'ala that this is clear. There were a group of Muslims, in fact early on, called Al-Murji'ah, and they're called this because it comes from Irja', which is to separate between faith as an entity and between a person's actions as another entity. This is an explicit hadith, and of course we have many verses that talk about this, and many obviously explicit hadith as well to this effect, that clearly here the Prophet is saying, if you believe in Allah on the last day, then this is something that you're going to be doing. So clearly, if you're a believer, that means that there are going to be actions that are going to be a part of that belief. And they actually prove that belief. Because you can't make a claim of belief unless it's backed up with some actions. And so here, these are actions that are very clear. Now, if a person is paying attention to these, then they will find out that these actions are not what we typically think of as acts of worship, but they're still part of faith, which is another indication that faith is not only that which is between, or the actions that are between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, they are a part of faith is the actions that are between you and the other people. And so every one of these 3 is between you and other people. Right? Your relationship, you and your neighbor, your relationship with the guest, and your relationship with everybody in terms of what you say. Right? Our tongues, unfortunately, most problems, societal problems, exist and happen because of our tongues, right? Because of what we say. So, to recap what we just said, faith is what's in the heart and the actions. And that these actions are not only the actions that are between, yani acts of worship that we typically think of like salah, dua, siyam, sadaqah, etc., that are between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in fact, they are the actions that are between us and the people. These are also part of iman, which is why if we see a person whose behavior with other people is not good, then this is also indicative of their iman. And if their behavior with other people is good, then this is indicative of their iman. This is why when the Prophet ﷺ was asked about a woman, there were two women, and Aisha, this is hadith narrated by Aisha, it's authentic, right? Where Aisha says, there is a woman, she prays, and not only does she pray the 5 times a day, but she prays a ton of tahajjud, she gives a lot in sadaqah, she does all these righteous deeds. And if you were to see her, she fasts almost every day. If you were to see her, you'd think, mashallah, and she's such a dutiful worshipper, except that, tu'zi jarataha, she harms her neighbors. And in some narrations it says, وَكَانَتْ صَلِيطَةٌ اللِّسَانِ صَلِيطَةٌ اللِّسَانِ, and her tongue is like a sword, right? It's powerful. Like when she talks, she hits hard. And people don't like dealing with her because she's too harsh with her words. What did the Prophet say about her? هِيَ فِي النَّارِ. He said she's in the fire. And then her neighbor, تُصَلِّي خَمْسَهَا, she just prays her 5 daily prayers. وَتَصُومُ رَمَضَانِ, she just fasts Ramadan, she doesn't fast anything more. وَتُؤَدِّي زَكَاتَهَا, and she gives her zakah, she doesn't give anything more. And she doesn't harm her neighbors, she doesn't harm anybody with her words or with her actions. And the Prophet ﷺ said about her what? هِيَ فِي الْجَنَّةِ, she's in paradise. You can be the most dutiful worshipper, but because of your actions, people are repulsed by you. People don't like to deal with you. You're super harsh. It has nothing to do. And this is why, and sometimes when you see people in their uber sense of religiosity, they take it too far, and they tend to repulse people, they push people away. It's very clear, the consequence of this. Where we should be accommodating to people. We shouldn't be pushing them away. And not only this, but our tongues have to be accommodating, our actions have to be accommodating, etc. So, this hadith is clearly telling us that the way that we behave with other people has a direct relationship with the level of our iman. In fact, it's part of iman. And then he mentions 3 categories. Number 1 is the neighbor. Who is the neighbor in Islam? Anyone in your neighborhood, right? So it's not just, so the Prophet ﷺ was asked, who is the neighbor that I should be kindest to? He said, the one who's closest to your door. أَقْرَبُ مِنْهُمْ بَابًا, right? The closest to your door. Very good. But then in some narrations it says, I have a neighbor of mine, but how far do I clarify as a neighbor? And many scholars of what? What did they say? Naam? 6 houses? Aywa, who said 40? 40 houses. So the majority said 40 houses. And in fact, some of the scholars like Az-Zuhri, he said, Arba'in, Arba'in, Arba'in. Arba'in. And he's like basically a 40 house radius. It's not just 40 total, but it's like 40 this way, 40 that way, 40. Basically the whole town. If you think about it, Aslan, in some of the towns back then, that was the whole town. Nowadays, our neighborhoods, yes, we can easily have 40 houses in a neighborhood, but that's your neighbor. What are the rights of a neighbor upon another neighbor in Islam? If that's how many classify as a neighbor, what's the right of a neighbor? Yeah, so one at a time. So you cover up his mistakes. You're not gossiping about your neighbor. You're not exposing his news. Oh, my neighbor last night came home at 2 a.m. I wonder where he was. You don't know where he was. That's a right. No, this is correct. This is true. Yeah, you don't harm him. Yes. So we'll come to this one. And what he's saying, we're going to delay it to the very end. What else? You visit him when he's sick. This is the right of us and general Muslim. تُطْعِمْهُ إِذَا طَعِمْت. You feed him when you eat. Right? Or you make sure that at least he has food. And this is why in some narrations they said, the Prophet ﷺ, he tells the people, if you cook like a dish, أَكْثِرْ مَاءَهَا. If you cook, especially a stew, add water to it so that you can share with your neighbors. So that they eat, they don't go hungry. Alhamdulillah, hunger is not necessarily the problem that we complain of at least us, living in the suburbs, but we still have certain rights, right? Making sure and gifting them, sharing any good that comes our way, helping them, assisting them. In some narrations it says you can't even build a tall wall so that the wind is not blocked by going to your neighbor. Something like a lot of we won't even think of. Obviously, no harm, etc. There was a guy who he put some things in the middle of the road. He left large things. It's narrated in the books, and it says that it caused harm to his neighbors. That he had to close off half the road because he was doing something. And he comes, so the man came and he says, "My neighbors are cursing me. What should I do?" And you know what he said? He said, "Allah has cursed you before your neighbors." Meaning because it harmed your neighbors, Allah was angry at their anger because of what you did. And the man, of course, said, "Okay, I'll move it immediately." And he did. Because we don't think, and he's like, "Oh, it's okay, and it's just the road, it's not a big deal, and whatever." And so sometimes we might inadvertently harm our neighbors, and we don't even realize. So we have to realize this. That's a general neighbor. He said something, he says, or you protect your neighbor's honor. We have many narrations that indicate one of the companions, I believe, it's not a hadith, but it's narrated by a companion, I think it was Abdullah ibn Amr, where he says, for you to commit zina with 10 different women is less in the eyes of Allah than to commit zina one time with your neighbor's wife. Why? He said, not because he's belittling the act of zina. Obviously, inshallah ta'ala, nobody falls into that sin. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us and our families and our loved ones. But he's saying this to indicate the severity of a sin when committed against your neighbor, because your neighbor has extra rights other than a stranger. And then he says the same thing about stealing. He says, for you to steal from 10 different houses is less in the eyes of Allah than to steal from your neighbor, because he has rights upon you as well. وَهَكَذَا, and he mentions all these other sins. So for you to do anything to your neighbor is so much worse than for it to be, obviously, nobody is saying that you should commit any of these deeds, right? But we're saying that doing any type of harm against your neighbor is so much worse. This is why we can't belittle this. So protecting his honor, protecting anything from harm. There was this idea of this collectiveness as a community, that we have each other's back and we should support one another, etc., that I think is lost. Unfortunately, especially in this day and age, most people don't know who their neighbors are. I barely know some of our neighbors. We have neighbors that barely moved in. We barely know who they are. People across the street, okay, yes. Alhamdulillah, we have Muslims in our neighborhood. We know them a little bit more. Which brings us to the second issue, the next issue, which is the types of neighbor. So you have 3 types of neighbors. A regular neighbor, doesn't matter if he's Muslim, non-Muslim. He has these rights that we all mentioned so far. Then you have a neighbor with 2 sets of rights, who is a neighbor and he's Muslim, because he has the rights of neighbor and he has the rights of Islam. And the rights of Islam are more broader than just being a neighbor. Then you have the third category, which is a person who is a neighbor and a Muslim and a relative, because now he has rights of being a relative as well. Haqqul qaraba. So haqqul qaraba, haqqul Islam, haqqul jar. And that neighbor, obviously, if he's a relative, that's even bigger and higher. So we have to keep these things in mind. The hadith, remember, some narrations say, فَلَا يُؤْذِي جَارَهُ, he should not be harmful, he should not harm his neighbor. And then another narration that says, فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ, he should be generous to his neighbor. And those are 2 different things. For me, so far we've mentioned, I shouldn't be harmful to my neighbor. Very good, we understand it. But the second one is, for me to be generous to my neighbor, I should reach out, be helpful, offer any assistance. If I see that he's in trouble, he's in need, he's whatever, and you rush over to their help, etc., etc. We should be aware of, we should be, sometimes it takes a keen eye to realize, hey, something is off. Maybe let me go check up on them. Or something might not be completely right. Because a lot of times we think, at least in this day and age, we fall guilty in this idea of, oh, you know what, I'm just going to stick to my business. I don't want to get into someone else's business. I don't know what's going on. But there might be some benefit in sometimes at least asking, like, hey, is everything okay? Everything all right? Checking up on each other, etc., etc. And there's a lot of good stories that happen as a result of this. People, neighbors, especially when we had the last ice storm, People, neighbors checking up on each other. You guys don't have any power. Do you guys need anything? Do you guys have water? Do you guys have food? Do you guys have whatever? Doing that type of neighborly thing, I think, goes a long way. And then, of course, us as Muslims, it's a huge, very beneficial form of da'wah that I think maybe we can take a hold of and go with, inshallah ta'ala, more. So, that's a little bit about the neighbor. Then he says, the category number 2, مَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيُكْرِمْ ضَيْفَهُ. Let him be, this is whoever believes in Allah on the last day, let him be generous to his guest. Let him be generous to his guest. Now, a guest that's meant in the sunnah here is not typically what we think of when we think of the word guest now. Why? Yes. So a guest, historically, was in the absence of this idea of a hotel. Nowadays, alhamdulillah, we have hotels. You can just book something, you get a room, etc. But back in the day, there was no such thing. There was no such thing as a hotel, right? So literally, Muslims would have to stay at another person's house. And here the Prophet ﷺ is encouraging this, and in fact, in some other narrations, he says, "Al-jar al-yawm wal-layla jaizatahu." And he should accommodate a guest for a day and a night. And some narrations it says 3 days and 3 nights. You accommodate the guest. The first day and night, you're generous, everything like this. After this, you can accommodate, but you don't necessarily have to feed. Or the fuqaha, the jurists differ on this opinion. Some say, no, you have to clothe. You have to feed and give, shelter up to 3 days. After this, whatever you give, it's out of your generosity. You don't have to accommodate them for more than 3 days. But this is typically for an out-of-town guest, right? Nowadays, we rarely get out-of-town guests who stay at our home. If we do, technically, Islamically, you should accommodate them for a day and a night. And this is not a problem. In fact, it's you applying the sunnah in the sense that you're generous to them, you're accommodating them, etc. But the idea now for us applies anytime we get a visitor. So a few things. Anytime we get a visitor, we should be very generous to the visitor, whether they're out of town or in town. And number 2, we also shouldn't be afraid or think of it as an inconvenience to visit one another or to invite each other over. Now, I know with the pandemic, this has kind of been put on a hold, but even in pre-pandemic times, and I know I'm guilty of this as well, is that we tend to not like to inconvenience ourselves or others by visiting them. Because sometimes people will be like, what's the visit for? Yakhi, nothing, I just want to visit you. It's very odd. And if I told somebody right now, hey, I want to come visit you, almost everybody will be like, khair, inshallah, everything okay? Is everything okay? All right, why do you want to? I just want to visit you. Now, historically, at the time of the Prophet, even before that, visiting each other was not only something that people did, but it was a good deed. How do we know that it's a good deed? There's multiple ahadith that mention this. وَجَبَتْ مَحَبَّتِي لِلْمُتَحَبِّينَ فِي وَالْمُتَزَاوِرِينَ فِي. My love, so there's a hadith Qudsi that says, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my love is mandatory for the ones who love each other for my sake and the ones who visit each other for my sake. Meaning they have no business with each other other than, he's a Muslim, I'm a Muslim, I want to visit him for the sake of Allah. That is a good deed. And there's that very famous hadith of the story of the 2 people from Bani Israel, and one wanted to go and visit the other, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts an angel on his way, it's a long journey, etc. And says, what are you doing? He says, I'm going to visit my friend. He says, do you have any business with him? No. Is there any relationship between you? No. Why are you visiting him? He says, because I love him for the sake of Allah. And then the angel tells him, I am an angel, and I have been sent to you to tell you that Allah has loved you back because of that love that you have for your Muslim brother. The fact that you just want to go and visit him, you want to spend time with him. It's a lost sunnah. At least not completely lost. But what I'm saying is, there's no harm in resurrecting this. Now sometimes in our day and age, it would be very awkward for me to call somebody and be like, hey, I want to come visit you. But at least you can invite somebody over. Purely, wallahi, just for the sake, we're going to have some tea, we're going to have some coffee, we'll visit each other for the sake of Allah. Right? As a pure act of worship. And I truly love this because I think one of the ways that we can strengthen our community is by seeing each other, even in our homes, building these relationships, strengthening the bonds that we have. and so on and so forth. So that is being generous to one's guests. Like I said, historically, there's a long discussion on if I go and visit somebody from out of town, can I spend more than 3 days? What if they don't give me, a visitation, etc., etc.? We have a story, Abu Hurayrah himself. In some narrations, there's a similar story, it seems to be by Abu Darda. But Abu Hurayrah is traveling. He stops by some people, a small village, and it's an outpost almost. It's in between some cities that he was traveling to. And he knocks, he goes there, and he says, Ana dayf, I am a guest. Can you guys give me just a day and a night? That's all I need, the 24 hours. He's not asking for the 3 days, just the 24 hours. Give me shelter. Now, he could theoretically camp outside. So like they didn't have camping gear, right? But staying with a group of people is always better, because even the Prophet ﷺ, when they would be out in expeditions, they would try to camp, like they would set up their tents spread out. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't like this. And there would be fitna, and sometimes things would happen, and so he commanded them to be as close, even in terms of their tents, as close to each other as possible. Just in case anything happens. He says this is closer to the sunnah. And they said in one narration their tents were so close together that if you threw one blanket, it would cover all the tents in one of those expeditions that was out. Because a lot of times we think, I want to give them their privacy, I'm going to be far away, I'm going to be this. In fact, the sunnah is for us to actually come together. Abu Hurayrah wanted to apply the same thing. So he goes to these people and he asks them, can you guys accommodate me? No. طيب. What am I going to do? He says, okay. So he goes out a little bit to the distance, sets up camp, but then he goes back to them and he says, would anybody like to join me at my camp? Okay? They said no. He said, Allahu Akbar. أين أنتم? This is what he asked them. أين أنتم من الإسلام? Where are you from Islam? You neither accommodate a guest, nor do you accept an invitation. Because we know one of the rights of a Muslim upon another is to at least to accept his invitation. He says, you don't accept me as a guest and you don't accept my invitation? He says, what are you? Are you guys even Muslims? And he's upset. So he goes back to his camp. After he said this, someone recognized him. Because Abu Hurayrah is Abu Hurayrah. He didn't tell him his name. Remember, Abu Hurayrah at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he was one of the companions. But as the years go by and more of the companions are passing away, the status of some of these companions who were younger, like Abu Hurayrah, increased. Abu Hurayrah died, I think, almost 60 Hijriya, or close to a little bit before. He lived until the 50s Hijriya. So he lived a long time after this, and he became very well known as an individual, recognizable. So one of the people in there recognized him, and they told everybody else, and once they heard, wait, that's Abu Hurayrah, the companion? So they went back to him, and they said, hey, we realized who you were, we didn't know who you were, ta'al, come back, come, you can stay the night with us. He says, now you have proven that you are indeed the worst of people, because who said that accommodations are only for those who you know? He asked them this question. من قال أن الضيف فقط لمن أعرف. Who is it? Who said that it's you're only a guest when I know who you are? You should accommodate anybody. If he's Muslim, you should accommodate him. Now, obviously, in our day and age, just to be clear, this can be a little dangerous. Admitting just a stranger in your house, even when he says he's a Muslim. I did this myself. Turns out he was an informant. We know because as soon as he was saying some crazy things. The same story that happened to Sheikh Yasir happened in a lot of other communities. I still remember his name and everything. He was like, I need a place to stay. The masjid wouldn't allow him to stay the night. So I told him, Ta'al, come, stay the night in my house. And he started telling me some crazy stuff. And I was like, brother, I don't think I can allow you to stay in my house anymore. This is back when we were single. We didn't, we weren't as careful as now that we have wives and kids. It's a little tougher. So, anyways, what I'm saying is, be careful, right? And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect and preserve us all, inshallah ta'ala. So, what was I going to say? Accommodating guests. So that's the second category. The last category is where he says, وَمَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ. And whoever believes in Allah and the last day, let him say something good or be silent. Right? And this is obviously supremely helpful when it comes to dealing with anybody. Because there's nothing that gets us into more trouble than our tongues and what we say. And if we're oblivious of this, then we've probably been getting into way more trouble than we think. And subhanAllah, there's a hadith that indicate that a lot of times a person will say a word, and in some of the hadith says, لا يلقي لها بالا. He doesn't even pay attention to the word, right? And it throws him in the hellfire, أبعد من بين المشرق والمغرب, farther than between the east and the west. Because he's not even paying attention to what he's saying. And then another person says a good word, and he doesn't even pay attention to it, and it saves him. And it elevates his rank as well. He's not paying attention. Obviously he's saying something good. So this tells us that our tongues, we have to safeguard. So many people have been destroyed because of their tongues. The hadith of Mu'adh, where Mu'adh was surprised. He says, are we going to be held accountable over our tongues? And the Prophet said, ثَكْرَتْكَ أُمُّكَ يَا مُعَاذ. May your mother lose you, O Mu'adh. And what has caused people to be thrown on their faces in the fire except what their tongues bring about? So we have to be very careful with our tongues. This is why many of the words of the wisdom, they say what? If speaking is from إذا كان الكلام من فضة فالسكوت من ذهب, right? Even some of the old Muslim scholars mention this. It's not a hadith. But they say, if speaking is silver, then silence is from gold. Because obviously silence will get you into less trouble. Now, are there cases where silence is better than speaking? Are there cases where, I'm sorry, let me repeat that, let me rephrase it. Are there cases where speaking is better than silence? Because obviously the hadith tells us what? Silence is better than speaking. Being quiet is better than speaking. But are there cases where it's the opposite? Speaking is better than silence? Yes. Not only this, but guess what? Let's say a person goes quiet for an entire day. Doesn't say a word for a day. 24 hours. Is that halal? Yeah, you can't. So let's say even outside of salah. Outside of salah, he doesn't say a single word for an entire day. There are a hadith that actually the Prophet ﷺ says it's haram to be silent for an entire day, 24-hour period. Because it resembles some pre-Islamic religious rituals where people would fast from speaking. And this is haram in Islam. You can't take a fast of silence. Siyam as-samt. Right? Similar to what Zakaria alayhi salam did. And people before this did. There was a man who took an oath. He said, I will not speak for like days. And the Prophet said, no, takallam, you have to speak. And we know that there's many hadith that say that mixing with the people is better than staying alone. Staying alone obviously entails that the person is silent unless they're in dhikr, unless they're praying. So we get the sense that actually speaking is good. And there are husbands who in their dealing with their wives, we've had this, I've seen this before. Like he gives her the silent treatment, he doesn't talk to her, he's upset. He doesn't speak a word. And why are you doing this? Haram, miskina, she's sorry, she's whatever, he's giving her the silent treatment. The guy's like, at least I'm not cussing her out, at least I didn't hit her. But the thing is, you don't realize that sometimes in your silence, you're doing more damage. Wallahi, than even something else. Right? Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be upset due to whatever happened. No, you have the right to be if you were wronged. But we can deal with it, we can handle it. But to be silent treatment, and I'm saying silent for like days. You can't do this. This is not us in a relationship anymore. So we have to be careful with our silence. We have to be careful with our speaking. Obviously, our speaking, we have to be much more careful than with our silence. But I'm saying that silence is not always a good choice either. Meaning there are times when speaking is better than silence. And in fact, there are times when speaking is mandatory. Right? Not just like in salah, but to say a word of truth or to clarify something, or when somebody is being wronged and you have to speak up for them, go ahead. You should actually say something, right? But majority of the time, those are exceptions. Because if you think about it, throughout the day and the night, did you ever have throughout a 24-hour period, are you going to come across a situation where you have to defend someone else? In terms of a day-to-day basis, it's not that common. As common as the regular mistakes that we make when we speak. In terms of exaggerating, in terms of maybe lying here and there, we think that they're white lies. People might think that, oh, I'm just going to make people laugh, or I'm going to be this, or I'm going to, embellish a little bit, or I'm going to, leave out some other things, or I'm going to whatever. These types of things, we have to realize these mistakes that we do, or I'm going to gossip a little bit, or you see what happened to these people, you see what happened to those people. And the thing is, all of this, and people justify it in their mind. You think like, if I'm in a gathering, I have to share something with them. I can't just be in a gathering and be quiet. I had a roommate. Wallah, an amazing roommate. He was Sudanese. And I mentioned I love people from Sudan. Sudanese roommate. And his other Sudanese friend would come over. They would make tea. And they would sit down in the living room. And I would be in my room, like I'm doing something. And then I'd come out and be like, I don't know if anybody's at home. I'd go out in the living room, and I'm seeing both of them are there. The TV's not on. Also, we didn't even have any cable or anything. This is back before any streaming. There was a little TV, one of those CRT TVs, but it's not on. And they're both there just drinking tea. Quiet. Wallahi, barely a word. And I'd be like, is this serious? Like, are you guys serious? Like, if I have... I'm usually a talker, right? So if I had a guest over, I'd feel awkward that it's silent. I would have to fill it with some sort of word. But these guys were completely comfortable in their silence. And I realized that it's okay to be comfortable in silence. Some people feel uncomfortable in silence. But it's actually okay to embrace that silence, even when you have another person. And literally I realized they just enjoyed each other's company. And he would come over, so I'm like, man, what are they going to talk about? So another time he came over, and this time I'm like, I'm going to sit in the dining room. I just want to, I'm so intrigued. Or do they, and he'd be like, oh, how was work? Alhamdulillah. How was your work? Alhamdulillah. Oh, how's your family? Alhamdulillah. How's your family? Alhamdulillah. Like, it's just literally, this is all, you can write, it would fill a page, best, their whole, and they would spend 2 hours, and they're just drinking tea, and it's like, you want me to, I can bring, and he'd bring more tea, he'd pour, he doesn't even ask him. Right? Part of being generous is that you serve, you bring to the guest without even asking the guest if he needs it. You're just presenting it. If he wants it, he wants it. He doesn't want it, balash. It sounds like wasting time. But is it wasting time? I can tell you, those guys, in those moments that they're together, you can tell they're completely tip-top shape. For their mentality, for their psychology, for their mental health, I can tell you, for them, it does the job. Everybody has the thing that gives them that relax. Because both of them, like I said, we were roommates, so both of them were single at the time. They didn't have any family. And literally, they're I have no idea. I don't want to generalize or anything like this, but I'm just saying, in general, I was very impressed. Now, obviously, he wasn't there every day. He wasn't there every day, right? But maybe twice, 3 times a week. It is. No, I'm with you. I can't. If I have a guest over, I'm sharing stuff, I'm talking 100%. No, go ahead.
It's part for being nice to the guest to speak with him, right?
This is our culture, صح? In our culture, if you have a guest over and you're not engaging him in conversation, the guest is like, what the heck? He wasn't even entertaining or anything like this. But if you think, many times, people would come over, like that Ansari, where the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr and Umar, they go to visit the Ansari man. If you read the hadith, the story, the Ansari was busy majority of the time preparing food for them. He wasn't actually sitting with them. Did they feel disrespected? No, they felt like he's doing something for us. It's not a problem. So the concept of guest, remember, for us, we have our cultural norms now, but back in the day, you don't have to be constantly engaged in dialogue. Historically, and like I said, even my friend, in their culture, it was completely fine. Not a problem. طيب, any questions? Inshallah. Any last questions? Okay. جزاكم الله خيرا. بارك الله فيكم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Thank you all for listening attentively. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all and bless us and accept from us all of our good deeds. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.